August 22nd, 1934. Late evening. The fog rolled across San Francisco Bay like a funeral shroud, wrapping itself around the island that would become America's most infamous prison. Somewhere in the darkness, a ferry cut through the black water, carrying 53 men toward a fate worse than death. And one of those men, the one the guards whispered about, the one the newspapers called Public Enemy Number 1, was about to learn a lesson that no amount of money could buy his way out of. Or so they thought. Al Capone pressed his face against the cold metal bars of the transport cage, watching Alcatraz grow larger through the mist. He was smiling. The same smile that had terrified senators, corrupted judges, and made rivals disappear across Chicago. Because Al Capone had a secret. Capone had spent years buying his way through the prison system. He assumed Alcatraz would be no different. Money had always been his skeleton key. He was about to discover that some locks cannot be picked. In Atlanta, that money had bought him a private cell with Persian rugs on the floor and a radio playing his favorite programs. It had bought him guards who called him Mr. Capone and looked the other way when Lucky Luciano came to visit. He had run his entire empire from behind bars like nothing had changed. The feds thought they had beaten him. The newspapers declared victory. Capone just smiled and counted his money. Now, as the ferry horn echoed against the rocky cliffs of Alcatraz, he was certain he would do the same thing here. After all, every man had a price. Every system had a crack. Al Capone had spent his entire life finding both. He was wrong about one thing. He would not simply repeat what he had done in Atlanta. Within 6 months, the most powerful gangster in American history would be reduced to sweeping floors and mopping corridors. The man who had never lost a battle would finally admit defeat. To understand why Capone was so confident stepping onto that island, you need to understand what he had already accomplished at Atlanta Federal Penitentiary. May 4th, 1932. Capone walked into Atlanta as just another federal prisoner. Within 3 weeks, he was running the place. His cell looked nothing like a prison cell. Persian rugs covered the concrete floor. Custom bedding replaced the standard-issue wool blankets. A top-of-the-line radio sat in the corner. And every evening, guards would pull up chairs outside his cell to listen to their favorite serials alongside the most dangerous man in America. Capone had a system. It was simple, elegant, and ruthless in its effectiveness. First, he identified what each guard needed. This one had gambling debts. That one had a sick mother. Another had a daughter who wanted to attend nursing school. Then Capone provided solutions. Cash appeared in lockers. Medical bills got paid. Tuition money materialized from nowhere. And just like that, Capone owned them. The warden granted him unlimited access to visitors. His wife May and his son Sonny stayed at a hotel just blocks from the prison, visiting every single day. But they were not his only guests. Lucky Luciano walked through those doors. Other associates from the Chicago outfit sat across from him discussing business. Capone conducted meetings, issued orders, and managed his Chicago empire as if the prison walls did not exist. He kept large reserves of cash hidden throughout his cell, generously tipping any guard who yielded to his special requests. The other inmates grew jealous. They watched Capone receive home-cooked meals while they ate slop. They watched him stroll through the yard like he owned it. Because he did. Word reached Washington. Attorney General Homer Cummings received reports that made his blood boil. Sanford Bates, head of federal prisons, confirmed the worst. Al Capone had turned Atlanta into his personal headquarters. Something had to be done. In August of 1934, they put Capone on a train so heavily guarded that newspapers dubbed it the Al Capone Special. The destination was a brand new facility designed for one purpose: to break men who could not be broken. But Alcatraz was built specifically for men like Al Capone, and Warden James Johnston had spent his entire career preparing for this moment. James Aloysius Johnston was not like other wardens. They called him the Golden Rule Warden during his years at San Quentin and Folsom, a man who believed in rehabilitation over punishment. But when the federal government asked him to design Alcatraz, Johnston created something different, a prison that would break the spirit without breaking the body. The rules were absolute. Inmates had 4 rights: food, clothing, shelter, medical care. Everything else was a privilege that had to be earned. No newspapers, no radio, no contact with the outside world except through censored letters. And silence. Complete silence in the cell blocks, in the mess hall, in the work details. Speaking without permission meant solitary confinement in a pitch-black cell they called the hole. Johnston had a custom of personally greeting every new arrival. On August 22, 1934, he stood in the processing room watching 53 men file in from the ferry. He had no trouble recognizing Capone. The gangster stood in line grinning, making smug comments from the side of his mouth to other inmates. When his turn came, Capone stepped forward with the confidence of a man entering his own office. He smiled at Johnston and began speaking on behalf of his fellow prisoners, asking questions as if he were their elected representative. Johnston cut him off cold. "You are prisoner 85 AZ, the warden said flatly. "Get back in line." Capone blinked. Nobody had spoken to him like that in 15 years. He tried again over the following weeks. He requested meetings with Johnston to discuss concerns. Denied. He offered to help improve conditions for other inmates. Ignored. He hinted that certain arrangements could be made, financial arrangements that would benefit everyone. Johnston did not even acknowledge the attempt. The cell they gave Capone measured 9 feet by 5 feet. Concrete walls, steel bars, a toilet and a sink. Nothing else. One day, after another failed attempt at negotiation, Capone finally admitted the truth. "It looks like Alcatraz has got me licked." Johnston smiled. Most men would have accepted defeat quietly. Capone did accept defeat, though it ate at him daily. The man who had ruled Chicago with an iron fist now swept floors and scrubbed laundry like every other inmate. But Alcatraz would not be the thing that finally destroyed Al Capone. That enemy was already inside him, waiting. Capone spent his first 3 months struggling. The silence rule tormented him. A man accustomed to giving orders could not even speak without permission. The guards watched him constantly, waiting for him to try something. He did try. He requested meetings with Johnston. Denied. He hinted at financial arrangements. Ignored. Every tool that had worked before failed him here. He watched supplies arrive on the ferry every Tuesday and Thursday morning. He watched the kitchen workers, the laundry crew, the men who cleaned the administration building, and he watched Warden with his power stripped away. Capone turned to music. He begged the warden for permission to play an instrument, claiming it would boost morale. Johnston, who believed in rehabilitation, approved the request after weeks of good behavior. May Capone sent her husband a banjo. It arrived on the ferry like any other approved package, inspected thoroughly, found to contain nothing suspicious. For the first time since arriving, Capone had something that brought him peace. Like every other inmate, Capone was assigned work details: laundry, library delivery, recreation yard sweeper. The man who had commanded thousands now pushed a mop and sorted dirty uniforms. Guards reported that he performed his duties without complaint, a model prisoner by all appearances. The shower room became his refuge, but not for the reasons one might expect. When other prisoners were in the yard, Capone would slip into the empty showers and play his banjo alone, the acoustics carrying his music through the steam-filled chamber. It was the only place he could escape the crushing silence of Alcatraz. Capone did try to corrupt guards. Old habits die hard. He identified men who seemed to be struggling financially. He made subtle offers, hinted at arrangements that could benefit everyone. But Johnston had trained his staff specifically for this. Every approach was reported. Every hint was documented. The guards at Alcatraz could not be bought, and Capone slowly realized that his money was worthless on the rock. The Rock Islanders formed as a genuine prison band. Capone played banjo, George machine gun, Kelly played drums. They performed Sunday concerts for the entire inmate population. For those brief hours, the men on the Rock could forget where they were, and Capone, strumming his banjo alongside other broken men, was no longer public enemy number one. He was just another musician trying to pass the time. By March of 1935, 7 months after arriving on the Rock, Al Capone had been thoroughly defeated. The man who had corrupted every institution he touched could not crack Alcatraz. Johnston's system worked. Capone followed rules, performed his duties, and played his banjo on Sundays. The gangster who had terrified America was becoming just another inmate counting down his days. But his time on the Rock was far from peaceful. Some enemies cannot be bribed or outmaneuvered, and one of them was waiting in the basement with a pair of scissors. The reality of Capone's life at Alcatraz was nothing like the empire he had run in Atlanta. There were no Persian rugs, no radio serials with friendly guards, no visits from Lucky Luciano, just concrete walls and the endless routine of a prison designed to crush the human spirit. His day began at 6:30 a.m. when the morning gong shattered the silence. He stood for count, cleaned his 9x5 cell, and marched to breakfast with 300 other men. They ate in silence, no talking, no eye contact, just the scrape of forks on metal trays and the watchful eyes of guards who had been trained to see everything. After breakfast, Capone reported to his work detail. The laundry room in the basement was a steam-filled hell where prisoners scrubbed uniforms and linens for hours on end. The heat was unbearable. The noise of the machines made thought itself difficult. Capone worked alongside bank robbers and kidnappers, all of them reduced to the same menial labor. The man who had once commanded an army of enforcers now answered to guards who called him by his number. 85 AZ, not Mr. Capone, not boss, just a number on a uniform, same as everyone else. Lunch, more silence. Afternoon work detail, count, dinner, count again. Recreation time in the yard, where inmates could finally speak, but where Capone found himself increasingly isolated. The other prisoners resented him. They saw him as a symbol of everything wrong with the system. A man who had bought his way through Atlanta while they rotted in cells. Some wanted his favor. Others wanted his head. The mess hall operated on assigned seating, and Capone ate surrounded by men who watched his every move. Was he planning something? Did he have connections they could exploit? Was he a threat or an opportunity? Capone had spent his life reading people, but in Alcatraz, he was the one being read. His attempts at influence failed repeatedly. A whispered suggestion to a guard was met with cold silence and a note in his file. An offer to help a fellow inmate resulted in a week of closer surveillance. The system Johnston had built anticipated every move a man like Capone might make. There were no cracks. There were no weak links. There was only the crushing monotony of days that blurred into weeks and months. The only genuine respite came through music. When Capone played his banjo during recreation time, or performed with the Rock Islanders on Sunday afternoons, something in him seemed to lift. Guards noticed that he smiled during performances, a real smile, not the predatory grin he had worn in Chicago courtrooms. Music gave him purpose in a place designed to strip purpose away. But even that small comfort could not protect him from the dangers of prison life. Capone had enemies everywhere, men who blamed him for friends killed in gang wars, men who resented his celebrity, men who simply wanted to make a name for themselves by taking down public enemy number one. In June of 1936, one of those enemies decided to act, and the attack that followed would reveal a truth far more terrifying than any prison conspiracy. The real enemy was not waiting in the barbershop line. It was already inside Al Capone's own body, slowly eating away at his mind. June 23rd, 1936. Early afternoon. James Crittenton Lucas stood in line outside the basement barbershop, waiting his turn with a pair of half-sharpened scissors hidden in his palm. They called him Tex, a bank robber from Albany. Texas, who had arrived at Alcatraz 18 months earlier with a 30-year sentence and a chip on his shoulder the size of Texas itself. Lucas had a grievance. Several weeks before, inmates had organized a work strike to protest conditions. They wanted Capone to join them, to lend his name and influence to their cause. Capone refused. He had his own operation to protect, and a strike would bring exactly the kind of attention he had spent nearly 2 years avoiding. He wanted to serve his time quietly and get out. Lucas took the refusal personally. If Capone would not stand with the inmates, then Capone was against them. The barbershop line moved slowly through the basement corridor toward the laundry room where Capone was working his usual detail. Steam billowed from the washing machines. The noise was deafening. Capone stood with his back turned, sorting through a pile of damp uniforms, completely unaware of the man approaching from behind. Lucas moved fast. He covered the 10 feet between them in seconds and plunged the scissors into Capone's back. Capone roared, the sound cutting through the mechanical noise. Despite his wound, he spun around and punched Lucas square in the jaw, knocking him backward, square in the jaw, knocking him backward. Some accounts say he grabbed his mandola and swung it like a club before guards could intervene. Guards rushed in and separated them before Capone could do more damage. The wound was superficial. Capone refused a stretcher and walked to the prison hospital under his own power. One hand pressed against his bleeding back, his eyes burning with a rage that terrified even the guards escorting him. Lucas went straight to solitary confinement. The investigation that followed was straightforward. Guards questioned Lucas about his motives. The answer was simple. Capone had refused to join an inmate strike several weeks earlier. Lucas and others saw this as betrayal, proof that Capone cared only about himself. The irony was bitter. Capone had stayed out of the strike specifically to avoid trouble. His attempt to be a model prisoner had made him a target. But the stabbing revealed something far more significant than prison politics. Doctors examining the wound noticed symptoms that concerned them. Tremors in his hands. Moments of confusion during questioning. Slurred speech that came and went without explanation. They made notes in his file, but said nothing to Capone himself. Over the following months, guards observed changes. The sharp-minded gangster who remembered every name and every favor occasionally lost track of conversations. He sometimes wore his winter coat in his heated cell, convinced it was freezing. He talked to people who were not there. In February of 1938, prison doctors delivered the diagnosis: syphilis of the brain. The disease he had carried since his youth, contracted during his early days in Chicago's underworld, had finally reached his mind. The stabbing did not end Capone's time at Alcatraz. The wound was superficial, and he was back to his work details within days. But that hospital visit revealed something that Capone himself did not yet know. The enemy that would finally defeat him was not James Lucas, not Warden Johnston, not the federal government. It was already inside him, eating away at his mind one cell at a time. Capone spent his final year on Alcatraz in the prison hospital ward, a shell of the man who had once terrified a nation. He wandered the corridors in confusion, sometimes believing he was back in Chicago running his empire, other times convinced that enemies were hiding in the walls. Guards who had once watched him with suspicion now watched him with something closer to pity. In January of 1939, they transferred him to Terminal Island in Southern California to serve out his remaining sentence. Warden Johnston stood on the dock and watched the ferry carry Capone away. He told reporters that Alcatraz had done its job. The great Al Capone had been broken, reduced from public enemy number one to a confused, diminished man who could barely remember his own name. Johnston had won. The system he designed had done exactly what it was supposed to do. It had taken the most powerful gangster in American history and reduced him to a confused invalid shuffling through hospital corridors. Alcatraz had proven that no man was untouchable. Not even Al Capone. Capone was released in November of 1939. His mental capacity reduced to that of a 12-year-old child. His wife May took him home to their mansion on Palm Island in Florida, where she cared for him through nearly 8 years of steady decline. The man who had built a criminal empire on violence and corruption, who had terrorized police and politicians across an entire city, spent his final days fishing in his private dock and playing cards with his grandchildren. He did not remember most of them. On January 25, 1947, Al Capone suffered a cardiac arrest in his bedroom. He was 48 years old. The newspapers ran headlines about the death of a monster, but the man who died that day was not a monster. He was barely a man at all, just a broken body housing a broken mind, paying the price for sins committed decades before. The most dangerous weapon is not a gun. It is knowing what people need before they know it themselves. Capone had understood that truth better than anyone who ever lived. It had made him untouchable on the streets of Chicago. But at Alcatraz, that weapon was useless. Johnston needed nothing Capone could offer. For the first time in his life, the master manipulator met a system he could not manipulate. The next time you hear someone talk about Al Capone as an untouchable mastermind, remember this story. Remember that the most feared gangster in American history was defeated not by bullets or rival gangs, but by a quiet warden who refused to play his game and a disease he had carried since his youth. Alcatraz did not just contain Al Capone. It broke him. And the man who had corrupted judges, politicians, and police officers across an entire nation could not corrupt a single guard on that rocky island in San Francisco Bay. Some systems cannot be beaten. Some men cannot be bought. Al Capone learned that lesson the hard way. It cost him everything.